Welcome to another STARS webinar. My name is David Earn. I'm Director of Programs and Communication at STARS. This is our 30th STARS webinar. For those of you who are here for the first time, STARS webinars are interactive discussions about future-oriented topics such as leadership, geopolitics, technology, climate change, and health. A select group of people is attending the webinar live, and hundreds more watch it later on as a recording. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Today we talk with Ivo DAALDER about whether and how the US can restore its leadership role in global affairs. Ivo is president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He served as the US ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013. Prior to his appointment as ambassador by President Obama, Ivo was a senior fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution. He also served as director for European affairs on President Clinton's National Security Council staff from 1995 to 1997. Ivo holds a PhD in political science from MIT, and he is the author and editor of 10 books. Ivo also serves as a member of the STARS International Board. Good morning to you, Ivo, and thank you for speaking in today's webinar.
Great to see you, David. My pleasure.
We now have 30 minutes to discuss with Ivo. As usual, I will take the privilege to ask the first couple of questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Ivo, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. Without any further ado, let's get started. In 2018, in the middle of the Trump presidency, you published your latest book titled The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership. In this book, you argued that the whipsawing of US policy has upended all that America's post-war leadership created, strong security alliances, free and open markets, and an unquestioned commitment to democracy and human rights. Why do you believe that with President Biden at the helm, the US is now ready to lead again?
Well, we'll have to see whether we are ready to lead again. But the premise of the empty throne was that the United States had abdicated and walked away, it had left the throne empty by, as you said, upending some of the verities of American foreign policy since 1945, which was that the United States security would be improved if it created and maintained security alliances with its democratic friends around the world, that its prosperity would be enhanced by establishing and maintaining an open and free market system and free trading system, and that its freedom and democracy would be strengthened if other countries were free and democratic and in which human rights were respected. And on all those three things, Donald Trump was the first of the presidents of the post-war period to walk away from it. He believed that security alliances were a burden on the United States, and to the extent they were useful, they were only useful if the allies paid the United States for the privilege of defending them. He did not believe in a free trade and open market system. He believed in bilateralism in trading relations in which tariffs were a means to exact greater engagement or lesser engagement, but at least found a way to upset the trading balance. And he was not a proponent of democracy or abroad, and certainly increasingly wasn't becoming a proponent of democracy at home, as we saw in the aftermath of the last election. Joe Biden, as a person who's been in US politics for over 50 years, who represents about as clear the mainstream of thinking about foreign policy, of course, embraces the traditional way in which the United States has approached the world in terms of security alliances, free trading systems, and particularly the importance of democracy and human rights. So he has the capacity and the inclination to get back on the throne, as he puts it, to take a seat at the table, or perhaps even at the head of the table. Whether or not that will actually lead to a resumption of American global leadership is sort of to be seen.
In your view, what concrete steps can or should the US take to restore its leadership role in global affairs?
Well, so I think it needs to take two very big steps, one of which Joe Biden has already, in fact, he's tried both of them, but one of them he has already demonstrated in the last few days, just in this trip. He needs to embrace the idea of working together with our allies and partners, and particularly our democratic allies and partners, to come up with common approaches for common problems, and go back to this idea that you use the institutions, whether it's the G7 or whether it's NATO or whether it is the Quad in East Asia, or other institutions, including multilateral institutions like the WHO and others, to bring together common perspectives and find common solutions. And the whole trip about America being back was back to that kind of effort. That, I think, is an important first step, and I think most of our friends in Europe and beyond have looked at this as a salutary development, and one they have long hoped would happen. But there's a second, and perhaps in the long term, a more important issue. The United States has lost a lot of credibility. It has, as a society, as a country, able to provide for and govern effectively at home. The way in which the pandemic was dealt with was an indictment of government, the deep polarization that exists within the country and persists in the country. Remember, we had more people voting in a presidential election in 2020 than ever before, and 74 million of them voted for Donald Trump, and 81 million voted for Joe Biden. It's a clear victory for Biden, but it's still a deeply divided country, which we continue to see in our politics through today. And there are indeed growing questions about the viability of the democratic system at home. And at the same time, there are real problems in the economic sphere. The pandemic has laid bare the deep inequities that exist in our society, racial inequities, but also economic inequities. At a time when the 25 richest Americans were benefiting from the pandemic by increasing their collective wealth by $400 billion in 1 year. That's a lot of money. Lots of other people were out on the street without sufficient support for their livelihoods. And of course, the racial crisis laid bare by the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, again, highlighted some deep structural inequities that exist in the system, and systemic racism that is part of the system. And one needs to deal with that in order to lead. You can't lead when you have problems at home. And as Biden, I think, recognizes this, he says it's not the example of our power, but the power of our example that is important for us to lead. So you have to address sort of this deep-seated problem with American democracy and with America's economic system, the way the system has been regulated to advantage the few over the many, in order to go back and provide the kind of leadership that the United States has been able to provide, and that, frankly, a lot of countries wish for.
Let's take the first question from the audience. The question comes from Hans-Jakob Roth, a former Swiss ambassador and now chairman of Eurasia Competence based in Yangon, Myanmar. He writes, why do we need anybody to lead in the 21st century? We have the UN system that should direct multilateral behavior, not this or that big power.
Well, it's a great question, and it's a collective action problem. As the economist would put it. So in theory, if you have a broad consensus on how the international system needs to be regulated and put together, you don't need leadership. It's the consensus of the system that provides the capacity to live up to rules, to develop new rules, and hopefully to enforce those rules. The problem is that we don't have a consensus. And frankly, we have never had a consensus in international politics. And without a consensus, it needs to be forged. And in order to do that, someone has to step up and be willing to take on the burden of underpinning the system. And traditionally, that is done by one or two or three or more great powers. The United States has done this for the last 75 years. It has been able to bring together diverse groups to deal with the big questions, not always successfully, but frankly, better than anyone else. It's difficult to conceive that you would have had a Paris climate summit without the United States. Indeed, the moment the United States walked away from Paris, much of the progress that was being made internationally within the UN system started to unravel, because other countries said, well, if the United States is walking away, then we can walk away too, because it really doesn't matter if the United States isn't part of it. That's just one example. I think the same is true with regard to the World Health Organization and others. Even in the UN system, in order to marshal agreement, someone or some buddies will have to take a leadership role. That's how you get collective action among a diverse group of folks. The problem with that is that a lot of countries will free ride on that collective action. That's fine, as long as you have someone who's willing to and able to pay for it.
On the first foreign trip of his time in office, President Biden just spent 8 days in Europe, meeting with G7, NATO, and EU leaders, and finishing off his trip yesterday in Geneva after having met with President Putin. Today, the Financial Times titled, and I quote, "Gangs replace rules in the new global order." And the subtitle read, "Joe Biden's week of summitry reclaims US leadership of the West as the world returns to great power rivalry." Would you share this assessment?
Sort of yes and no, but so I don't think the return to great power rivalry is foreordained. I think great power competition, yes, and it depends on how you define rivalry, and rivalry has a confrontational tone to it, and I don't believe that it is inevitable that we will divide the world once again in different blocks or different confrontations that can ultimately lead to conflict. I think it's possible, and in fact, current trends are sort of leading in that direction. But the way Biden is approaching this issue, and I think he's right about it to approach it, is to say we're in a competition, and we're in a competition not just for power and influence, which is right normal in international politics, but a competition about who is the better exemplar for what needs to happen to take care of people's at home. And he, I think, rightly makes this a competition between a democratic form of government and an autocratic form of government. I mean, part of Xi Jinping's appeal is that we can get stuff done. We were confronted with the coronavirus and figured out by building hospitals and a new testing system, and then through lockdowns of entire cities and indeed much of the country for a while, and a very, very effective, though I would say perhaps brutal at times, lockdown in the system anytime there is a positive test, as is happening in Guangzhou right now. But providing for a system that can dealt with the virus and the disease in a pretty effective way. Compare that to the chaos that was and continues to be part of how the West responded to this, particularly Europe and the United States. And you can see the difference in the system. And Biden's argument is that if we bring the democracies together to be more effective in dealing with the demands of our citizenry, that we're more effective in dealing with COVID. And I would argue that on the vaccine development, you can see how it can happen in terms of scientific innovation, government support, and indeed distribution systems. So that when I walk around Chicago today, it is no different than it would have been in 2019 in terms of how people are behaving and going about their daily lives. And being effective in providing for the needs and the wants of the people is what this is all about. It's about doing for oneself as opposed to beating the other side in terms of the competition that exists. So I don't see this necessarily as a a rivalry in confrontational terms. I see it as a rivalry in competitive terms, and the two are very different. And it's kind of hidden by this idea that Biden is continuing the policy that Trump had with China. Yes, in the sense that China is no longer seen as likely to evolve into a liberal economic, let alone liberal democratic country. In that sense, it's the same. But the way in which the strategy is being put together is completely different. Trump went it alone. Biden is going together with its allies. Trump wanted to confront and indeed beat the Chinese. The Biden wants to work with our allies to make our system more effective and more able to provide, and in that sense, outcompete the Chinese, but doing so by example rather than the force of power.
After the G7 summit, the Biden administration announced a G7-backed plan known as Build Back Better for the World, or B3W in short, to build climate-friendly infrastructure projects across the developing world. Against the backdrop of rising US-China competition, the plan is widely perceived as a direct challenge to China's Belt and Road Initiative. What's your view on this? What is this new program really about, and how does it differ from the BRI?
I mean, I think it is in some ways designed exactly within the context of the competition that I just described. It is trying to provide an alternative to the BRI for countries to invest in and to be part of. Its purpose is to answer the question that many of us traveling around the world have heard. I was in Ethiopia a few years ago, quite taken by the fact that China is really everywhere, and Addis Ababa has provided major financial and infrastructure support and built the African Union building and a variety of other places. And when asked of the Ethiopian government and other officials, why is it that you're relying on China? The answer is, well, there's no alternative. And so by providing an alternative, by having the G7 countries who together provide for more economic aid and in potential development assistance and effort than China does, to provide that alternative, and then focus it not to the benefit of China. The BRI is fundamentally about helping China's industrial and logistical efforts, its own companies and its own factories, and creating an aid dependency, or in their case, it's not aid, an investment dependency and a loan dependency that the B3W is supposed to counter. Now, that's great in theory. Let's see how it works in practice, because in practice, of course, the projects and the money and what is being brought to that is basically adding up everything that G7 country and the European Union are doing already, and making that selling it as an integrated approach. It needs more money and more capabilities. It needs to be integrated within the Paris Agreement's support for the green transformation in the investment, but at least provide that framework for that kind of competition.
According to the NATO communique released after the meeting, NATO leaders view China's growing influence and military prowess as, quote, systemic challenges to the rules-based international order. This is the first time that NATO has formally addressed the threat posed by China's military ambitions. So I would like to ask you, as former US ambassador to NATO, how important is that? Is this a game changer for NATO's approach towards China?
It's not a game changer in the sense that NATO is now going to pivot and become an anti-China military alliance. It is an enlargement of the reality of the system and of the security situation overall in the world, and that reality is defined by two fundamental new factors. One is that China is in Europe and near Europe. It is in Europe in terms of its BRI initiative in the Western Balkans, of course, but also in Greece and Italy. Italy is a BRI partner. And so its presence is economically is already there. In some cases, positively, but in some cases, for example, in the degree to which Montenegro is now indebted to Beijing, a challenge to the internal stability of Europe. China is also present militarily. It is conducted naval training exercises with Russia in the Mediterranean. It has started to put its ships into the Arctic oceans, which of course also is part of near NATO territory. It has a military base in Djibouti, and as a result is more closely associated even to Europe and potentially for European security. So paying attention to what China is doing, having a discussion and exchanging information with that at NATO is now a necessity. There's then the larger issue, the quote that you had on the reality that China is the only power aside from the United States that has the economic, military, and increasing political weight to challenge the international order as it has evolved over the last 75 years. Whether it will do so remains to be seen, but it has that capacity. So just as the EU recognized a few years ago that China was a systemic rival, now NATO has concluded that China is a systemic challenge. I think the challenge is a weaker term and probably in some ways a more appropriate term given how much more we need to find out about where China is going. But it puts the alliance on notice and frankly puts China on notice that the alliance is watching.
We have a follow-up question from Srinath Rangarajan. He's the global head of automotive research at Oliver Wyman. He's asking, how do you see the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy? Could it be a counterbalance to China as a superpower?
So the Indo-Pacific strategy is evolving, and we haven't seen all of the details yet. But it clearly is designed to bring together, in the first instance, our advanced industrial partners, Japan, Korea, and Australia, the three major economic and democratic powers in the region, who are also, by the way, security allies of the United States in the bilateral framework, plus an extended and extensive dialogue with India as part of the Quad, which does not include Korea, but includes Japan and Australia, the US, and of course, India. And a part of that is to enhance the capacity and, if necessary, to respond to Chinese activities that threaten regional Asian Pacific security. And China in recent years has taken a large number of deeply disquieting steps, starting with contesting Japanese sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands, then by expanding its influence and claim on the South China Sea, including by creating islands out of nowhere in a quite remarkable fashion, claiming territorial waters that frankly belong to other countries like the Philippines and Vietnam. It has engaged in military skirmishes with India in the Himalayas, a long contested area, but has now taken territory that clearly does not belong to it and on the other side of the line of confrontation, and even sliced off whole parts of Bhutan in order to enhance its influence. And of course, it has posed, a ever increasing challenge to Taiwan, including flying bombers and aircraft on Taiwanese airspace repeatedly, including just 2 days ago in response to the NATO declaration. So having the United States and the major countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, working together, possibly to respond to and deter further Chinese advances on the security side is important. And at the same time, it is part of that overall competition strategy that I mentioned earlier, where the United States is trying to bring together its friends and allies in North America, in Europe, and Asia to offer an alternative and a better alternative to the world and to the people of these countries than China does.
Let's also briefly talk about Russia. In fact, the NATO communique references Russia 62 times compared to just 10 times for China, which can be read as a clear sign that NATO's main priority, at least for now, firmly remains on the Eastern Front. What perspective do you see for relations between NATO and Russia in the next few years?
Well, as Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, said, the relationship between NATO and Russia is now at its lowest point since the end of the Cold War, and I think that's a fair prescription. Vladimir Putin said the same thing with regard to U.S.-Russian relations in his interview with NBC News prior to the summit. It wasn't repeated yesterday in the press conference, but frankly, even a 3-hour meeting of the two presidents is not going to overcome the deep distrust and that exists between NATO countries, including the United States and Russia, and for good reason. The Russian activities in the last many years, certainly since 2008, and you can argue for longer than that, have been deeply confrontational and worrying and disruptive. From the overt use of military force in Georgia and Ukraine and Syria and indeed in Libya, to the kind of hybrid engagement that we saw in Crimea, to perhaps at the most worrisome, the very active cyber attacks and intrusions on European and American electoral systems, and increasingly through the ransomware attacks on the economic system. And so Russia has the capability and increasingly the willingness to use military forces in ways that are threatening to the security and political independence of NATO, of the NATO states. And what's notable that in the NATO communique, Russia is described as a threat and China is described as a challenge. And a threat requires different kind of direct military responses of the kind that NATO has engaged in, at least since 2014, in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that are different from how you deal with a challenge like China. And I think, while much has been made about adding China to the NATO discussion, the fundamental focus of NATO on the military side remains defending and deterring the potential intrusion of Russia in all its forms onto NATO territory.
We are already running out of time, but if you allow, I would like to ask you 2 final questions. Both Beijing and Washington know that any serious plan to avert a global climate catastrophe requires cooperation between the world's #1 polluter, China, and the US, which is #2. The Biden administration has also made climate an essential element of US foreign policy and national security. What does it take for the US and China to really work together on climate while fighting about practically everything else?
So it was interesting that Biden yesterday in his press conference talked about not trusting Russia, but believing that moving together on certain issues was in our own in a mutual self-interest. And frankly, addressing climate change is not something you do for someone else, you do it for yourself, because the threat is as large to oneself as it is to anyone else. So I think the basis of a future cooperation between the United States and China on the issue of climate change is that if we don't cooperate, we're both going to suffer. While in the short term, non-cooperation or ignoring climate change you may think that has some short-term benefits, in the long term, we're all going to suffer. And it's that dialogue, that idea of mutual self-interest, that has to be the basis for cooperation. It can't be just because it's the morally right thing to do. That's fine. But when it's in the self-interest, then it's morally and in the self-interest to do, and that needs to be the basis of cooperation. Indeed, that's true for climate change. It's true for many of the issues that we talked about. The basis of cooperation, if one's based on self-interest, is more likely to succeed than if it is done for altruistic reasons.
Final question. From today's point of view, how likely is President Biden to be re-elected in 2024?
If I knew that, I'd be a rich man. I think that is very much TBD, and it depends on the degree to which he can get his pretty progressive agenda, his very progressive agenda through Congress. There is a small route to get it through, but it's tiny and it may not work. And it depends in over the long term on how the economy overall responds and delivers the benefits to a large number of people, and whether Biden will be credited for having done so. Ultimately, people vote their pocketbook, and to the extent that the economy improves and Biden is seen as the person who helped create the conditions for this through the vaccine distribution and dealing with COVID writ large, and the economic programs that he has already and hopes to continue to push through Congress, his chances for re-election will go up.
With that, I would like to thank you very much, Ivo, for your time and for sharing your insights with us. Thank you, Ivo.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. And all the best to you as you go on your new adventures.
Exactly. I would also like to thank all our alumni who participated in today's webinar. STARS webinars are now off for a summer break, and they will resume in September. This was also the last webinar for me, as I'm leaving STARS at the end of the month to take up a new professional challenge at Swiss Re. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Take care, stay healthy, and till we meet again. Thank you and goodbye.